Throughout history, humans have used tattoos to protect themselves against sorcery, claim membership in groups, declare their love, honor their loved ones, or simply express themselves. And it looks like tattoos are going nowhere because as of 2022, 46% of the United States population has at least one. That's why it's not shocking that tattooing has taken the 6th spot amongst the fastest growing industries in the country. And it's safe to assume that this percentage will only go up. But have you ever stopped and wondered when this form of body modification came into existence and how it changed over the years? Let me tell you. Tattoos date back thousands of years. Have you ever heard about Otzi the Iceman? He's the 5,200-year-old mummy who was found embedded in glacial ice in 1991 in the Ötztal Alps. Yep, that's how he got the nickname Otzi. The reason I'm talking about him now is that he holds the record for the oldest tattoos in the Guinness World Records. He had 61 markings across his body that are considered to be tattooed by the experts. These markings are composed of vertical and horizontal lines which were created from fireplace ash or soot pigment. Otzi, however, was not trying to express his true self with them. When they examined Otzi's bones in detail, they noticed that there was age or injury-related degeneration on the tattooed areas of his body. This made scientists believe that his tattoos may have been related to discomfort relief treatments similar to acupuncture. That also explains the somewhat random distribution of those markings on his body. Experts also believe the fact Otzi had so many tattoos means that others in his culture knew about tattooing and that he wasn't the first person ever to have tattoos. Although Otzi's tattoos are considered to be therapeutic, evidence of figurative tattoos, which are images of real subjects such as animals and so on, were also discovered on 2 5,000-year-old Egyptian mummies. As well as pushing back evidence of the practice of tattooing in Africa by 1,000 years. This discovery also holds the importance of changing the belief that only Egyptian women got tattoos. However, other mummies with tattoos have been recovered from at least 49 archaeological sites, including locations in Greenland, Alaska, and the Philippines, which only suggests that tattoos were a worldwide thing. But despite all this evidence that shows the art of tattooing is ancient and universal, the exact date of when and where it began is unknown. There are written records that date tattoos back to 5th century BCE Greece, where they were used to mark criminals and enemies so that it would be easier to identify them if they tried to escape. Romans and Persians also used tattooing for the same purposes. Other cultures, on the other hand, had different uses in mind. In the Philippines, tattoos were symbols of tribal identity, kinship, bravery, beauty, and social or wealth status. They were also believed to have magical abilities and were done as protective talismans against any evil supernatural forces. Consequently, the process of tattooing was believed to be sacred, therefore it involved some rituals. For example, if an artist or a person who was about to get a tattoo sneezed before the tattoo began, this was seen as a sign of disapproval by the spirits. So the session would be called off or rescheduled, and once a tattoo was complete, a celebration usually would be held on its behalf. When it came to ancient Egypt, tattoos were originally used to show a dedication to a deity, and they were believed to convey divine protection. What's worth mentioning here is the fact that many of the tattooed mummies discovered in Egypt were female. One of those mummies came to be known as Amunet, the tattooed priestess of Hathor, who had a variety of tattoos on her body. When she was first discovered, experts initially thought that due to the placement of her tattoos, these were either done as a medical treatment for a lower body condition, or they were simply the markings of lower status. But in recent years, a further examination revealed that she was a person with high social status, so the previous theory was debunked. This discovery led some to believe that her tattoos possibly functioned as protection against the difficulties of pregnancy and childbirth. Now let's take a look at Japan's history with tattoos. Tattooing for spiritual and decorative purposes was widespread in Japan, and it actually extended back to at least 300 BCE. Some written texts also describe tattooing and other bodily markings to indicate social differences among Japanese people. By the 17th century, however, most criminals were tattooed as a mark of punishment. And by the mid-19th century, tattoos were banned altogether. And those who had them were viewed as lacking respectability, which in turn created a subculture of outcasts, who formed the roots of the Yakuza. But how did the modern and more expressionist role of tattoos in the Western world begin? James Cook was a British explorer and captain who was famous for his 3 voyages to the South Pacific, which took place between 1768 and 1779. During one of these voyages, he traveled to the Tahitian Islands, where he was introduced to the art of tattooing. When he landed on the island, he was surprised and impressed by the heavily tattooed men and women, and he wanted to make note of them in his logbook. So, to describe their body art, he used the term tattoo after hearing the locals use a word that sounded similar to it regarding their markings. Before that, tattooing was simply referred to as scarring, painting, or staining. Many of Cook's crew returned to England with tattoos from this voyage, which, in return, restarted a tattoo tradition among the sailors. They started using tattoos as a way to record their travels. For example, they would get an anchor tattoo if they crossed the Atlantic Ocean successfully, or a shellback turtle tattoo if they crossed the equator. This paved the way for the traditional style of tattooing. By the 19th century, although tattoos were still largely associated with sailors, they had spread to British high society as well. During the 1870s, they had even become fashion statements among some members of the upper classes, as well as royalty. The people who had them among the high society included British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and his sons, as well as several of Queen Victoria's relatives. It was even rumored that she herself had a tattoo of a tiger fighting a python in the area of her body that could easily be covered with clothes, just in case. This all led to tattoos becoming a mark of wealth by the late 1880s. In 1891, the tattoo machine was created by Samuel O'Reilly, who was a New York City tattooer himself. His design was based on a modification of Thomas Edison's electric pen, which was originally designed to help businesses with document duplication. It was also around the same years that tattooed women started to make appearances, though mostly in the circuses to entertain people. Although that industry eventually slowed down, by the 1920s, more women began to get tattoos as a cost-effective alternative to makeup, since products were so expensive at the time. In 1939, Mildred Hull became the first female to open her own tattoo shop in New York. It was around this time that the US introduced Social Security numbers, and many citizens got theirs tattooed on their bodies as a memory aid. However, despite these tattoos, decorative tattoos continued to be looked down upon. If you had a tattoo during the 50s or the 60s, you would still be viewed as a rebel or a criminal by the majority of people. In 1961, the New York City Health Department actually banned tattoos because they saw them as the cause of spreading diseases. The ban was not lifted until 1997. Today, tattoos are so common that even toys have them. So there's no ban, no stigma, no style or color restriction, and nothing to stop you from getting the tattoo of your dreams. Maybe except your mom.
The theory of parallel worlds has been discussed in the scientific community for a very long time. Unfortunately, we're not developed enough yet to prove or disprove it. But it's still an interesting theory, and that's why we have a lot of unusual urban legends about the guests from a parallel reality, according to many. Let's check out a few of them. A man from a non-existent country. This story took place in 1851 in a small German village, Frankfurt an der Oder. A lost man came out to the local villagers asking for help. The man introduced himself as Jopar Voren. He spoke very poor German and had a very strong accent. The man himself claimed that he speaks Laxar and Abram, languages that don't actually exist on our Earth. He claimed to be from Laxaria, a country on the mainland called Sacria, separated from Europe by a huge ocean. However, none of these places existed on the Earth's map. People sent Yopar to the local authorities. He talked to a psychiatrist, but the doctor concluded that the man was totally sane. An investigation by the local police also revealed nothing suspicious about him. Yopar Vorin claimed that the purpose of his visit to Europe was to find his long-lost brother. He survived a shipwreck and found himself near the village. They showed him a map of the world and a globe and asked him to indicate the place where he crashed, but he didn't recognize anything familiar. He seemed to have extensive knowledge about his homeworld. Yopar named 5 main continents on it: Sacria, Aflar, Ostar, Auslar, and Uplar. His story was considered plausible. Scientists from Frankfurt decided to send the man to Berlin for further research. However, during the trip, he had something like a seizure. The man suddenly jumped out of the carriage and disappeared into the surrounding forest. Despite a long and thorough search, no traces of Yopar were found. He seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. Inspector Leboeuf, who was assigned to escort him to Berlin, thought this man could be a being from another world, and that he had returned from where he had come from. Lady on Highway 167. This incident happened on October 20th, 1969. It was first reported in 1988 in the magazine Strange. The article tells about 2 men, LC and his business partner, Charlie. The names are fictitious. One afternoon, LC and Charlie were driving along Highway 167 in southwest Louisiana. Discussing work, they drove toward the oil center of Lafayette. The highway was empty at first, but then the men noticed a very old and very slow car ahead. The men started discussing this mysterious car. Such cars hadn't been produced for several decades, but this one looked quite new. The men thought it was thanks to the owner's care and admired it. They slowed down to get a better look at the car. LC noticed a bright orange sign on it that said 1940. They saw a driver. It was a young woman in old-fashioned clothes, a hat with a long feather and a fur coat, even though it was warm outside. There was a child next to her, also dressed in a warm coat and a hat. LC and Charlie wanted to talk to her, but then they noticed the expression on her face. The woman was looking around in panic, almost on the verge of crying. LC called out to her and asked if she needed help. She nodded, and he gestured for her to park on the side of the road. But when the men also parked, they suddenly noticed that the woman's car had disappeared. They looked around the highway in shock. She couldn't have gone somewhere far so fast, but the car was nowhere to be found. After some time, another man drove up to LC and Charlie. He saw everything that happened and claimed that the car had simply disappeared. The men talked about the incident for several hours. When they reached the city, they contacted the police. However, the police couldn't help them in any way. Apart from their words, there was no confirmation of the existence of the car. The case was discussed for a while in local newspapers, and then was forgotten. The Gadianton Canyon Incident. This incident occurred in May of 1972 in southeastern Utah near the Modena Railroad crossing on the edge of the Escalante Desert. Jenna North was driving her father's 1971 Chevrolet Nova. Her friend, Carol Abbott, was in the passenger seat. In the back seat, there were 2 other girls, Lisa Rockford and Bethany Gordon. It was after 10 p.m. when the girls crossed the Utah-Nevada state line. They wanted to get back to campus before their housekeeper, Mrs. Mortensen, locked the dorm doors. This stretch of Highway 56 in Utah is pretty deserted. There's nothing there but sand and a few plants. The girls were very happy when they finally noticed the Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Modena. But right behind the railing, Jenna noticed 2 highways. One went into the desert, and the other to Gadianton Canyon. The girls decided to take the road to the canyon. They thought it would be a shortcut to campus. The other girls were chatting with each other when Jenna noticed that they were no longer driving on asphalt, but on white cement. "Watch out!" suddenly shouted one of the girls. The road ended abruptly at a high rock wall. It was a dead end. They had to go back the same way they came here. And while Jenna's friends were complaining that now they would have to sleep in the car, Jenna saw that the landscape had changed dramatically. They weren't in the desert anymore. Instead, the canyon turned into an open area with wheat fields, pine thickets, and a small lake ahead. A full moon was shining in the sky, which was strange because it shouldn't have been there that night. The girls had no idea where they were, so they just drove to the light ahead. It was some building that they thought was a diner or restaurant. The girls saw a bright neon sign, but none of them could read what was written on it. These symbols were unlike any language they knew. Suddenly, several people came out of the building. They seemed shocked and frightened by Jenna's Chevrolet. They waved their hands and shouted something, but the girls didn't understand them. Lisa decided to ask the men for directions. She stuck her head out of the window and immediately let out a terrifying scream. "Get out of here!" she shouted to Jenna. The Chevrolet sped away from the building. Bright headlights illuminated their car from behind. They were being chased by a few vehicles. These vehicles were egg-shaped, had 3 wheels, and made a buzzing sound. The road ahead led back to the canyon. Jenna didn't have time to slow down and crashed right into it. The vehicles had disappeared, together with an unfamiliar landscape. The girls were back in the desert again. Fortunately, none of them were hurt, physically. But Lisa was in a state of shock. She was saying again and again, "They weren't human!" The girls had to help her walk. An hour later, they were able to stop a Utah Highway Patrol car. They told the police their story. The details of the report compiled by the police officer were complicated and confusing. During the investigation, the police couldn't figure out from the tire tracks exactly where the car went astray. The tracks ended very abruptly, as if the Chevrolet had suddenly disappeared. The police couldn't explain how the car could have driven 2 miles without leaving any traces, especially on such solid ground. There are still disputes about this story, but in the end, all versions and explanations of what happened are just guesses. Perhaps we'll never find out the truth. These were the urban legends about interdimensional traveling. Of course, there's no proof that any of these stories are real. Often the truth turns out to be very mundane. For example, the famous man from Taured, who people also called a guest from another reality, turned out to be a simple fraudster named John Allen Kuchar Zegrus. But even so, these stories are still very interesting.
It's winter, 1980. We're in the small town of Lengby. 19-year-old Jean Hilliard is driving home after meeting with a friend. She takes a shortcut and turns into an icy, slippery road. In the dark, she loses control of the rear-wheel drive car. The vehicle crashes into a ditch. Emergency lights, snowfall, night, and a hard frost. Jean gets out of the vehicle. She's wearing only a light winter coat, mittens, and cowboy boots. The air temperature is much lower than in a freezer. Jean is sure that her friend lives nearby, so she goes that way. She climbs a high hill and realizes she's taken the wrong route. It seems she's gotten lost. The girl wanders a couple more miles and notices her other friend's house in the distance. Freezing, she walks there. Then everything turns black. Jean loses consciousness. The next morning, rancher Wally Nelson wakes up in a great mood. It's the holiday season. There's a winter fairy tale outside the window. He leaves his house and notices the body of Jean Hilliard lying just a few feet from his porch. Wally approaches the girl, shakes her, and is horrified. Her body is stiff and cold like frozen wood. Her eyes are open and don't move. Her hair is frozen. She just doesn't look alive. But Wally sees that she's still breathing. Jean has managed to survive. Wally wants to put her in his car to bring her to the doctor, but the girl's body doesn't bend and can't fit into the auto. It feels like a statue. He takes a bigger car and rushes to the hospital as fast as possible. The doctors take Jean, but they don't think she has any chance to make it. Her hand is so hard and frozen that no needle can penetrate it. A low temperature, glassy eyes, and muscles as hard as stone are all the results of emergency mode. Her body has directed all the blood to the vital organs to ensure their functioning. That's why other parts of her body look so lifeless, and her skin and muscles don't react to anything. The doctors decide to put heating pads on the girl to warm her up. Her family hopes for her recovery, but right now, all they can do is just wait. Frostbite is so dangerous because all that frozen liquid begins to expand. Fill a small bottle with water and put it in the freezer for a few hours. Then take it out, and you'll see that the bottle seems to have expanded or even cracked because of the increased volume of the liquid. The same thing happens inside our bodies. We consist of almost 70% water. When it freezes, its particles turn into ice crystals and tear cell membranes. Ice fragments can stretch and destroy tissue. This is called frostbite. Also, our body can slow down all internal processes in extreme cold conditions to save strength and energy. The heart makes fewer beats, and the lungs stop consuming lots of oxygen. Metabolism slows down. It happened with Jean, and perhaps it is what saved her life that day. She was lying in the snow in severe frost for about 6 hours. But why didn't the ice particles start destroying her cell membranes? How did her body withstand such damage and manage to survive? Back at the hospital, doctors are happy to watch Jean get better. Warm blood spreads through the frozen vessels and brings her body back to life. Surprisingly, ice crystals haven't damaged her muscles and skin. A few hours later, the girl regains consciousness. By noon, she starts talking. Jean doesn't know what happened. She remembers walking to her friend's house and then waking up in the hospital. What worries her most right now is that her father's car is somewhere in a ditch. As it turns out, the girl fell down and crawled on all fours to Wally Nelson's house. She doesn't remember it, but apparently her brain activated the survival instinct that night. Unfortunately, she didn't manage to crawl the last few feet. Jean passed out at the door and stayed there for 6 hours. Doctors examine the girl and understand that she's completely healthy. Soon, she's discharged from the hospital. This case isn't unique. One professor of emergency medicine, David Plummer, said he'd seen about 12 similar cases over the past 10 years when patients had survived severe frostbite. Jean returns home and finds out that she has become famous. People write about her in newspapers, want to interview her, and film documentary shows. Her case has attracted the attention of many doctors around the world, but no one has been able to find out exactly how she managed to survive. In the case of humans, such recoveries seem like an absolute miracle. But many creatures of the natural world can adapt their bodies to extreme conditions. One of them is the tree frog. These animals live mainly in temperate and tropical parts of Eurasia. Sometimes they have to contend with cold weather. Their body injects glucose into the bloodstream when they feel they're freezing, and the content of their cells turns into syrup. Sugar lowers the freezing point of water. So, tree frogs have adapted to such conditions. The water outside their cells can freeze. Their bodies can get as hard as ice cubes, but they will be alive, feeling great. Then, when it gets warmer, they fully recover. The blood fills their body and puts all their muscles in motion. But one of the most amazing animals that can withstand freezing temperatures is the ghoulish icefish. It's transparent and somewhat like a jellyfish. It swims in the dark, cold Antarctic waters. The ghoulish icefish feels comfortable there because of the antifreeze in its body. More precisely, it's a unique substance that is like antifreeze in its functions. This liquid doesn't allow the animal's cells, organs, and the whole body to freeze. There are no red blood cells in the fish's blood that transport oxygen throughout its body. This is the only vertebrate with such a superpower. There are organisms on our planet that use the cold to prolong their life. Scientists have found some of them in the ice of Siberia. Those are microscopic, multi-celled creatures, like small worms, that can live in a freezer for about 10 years. But the worms from Siberia were about 24,000 years old. The scientists transported them to the laboratory and thawed them. The worms came to life and began to multiply immediately after all those centuries of sleep. Their bodies can go into cryptobiosis. This is when an entire frozen organism has minimal vital functions. The analysis showed that the worms could stay in this mode for tens of thousands of years. And there are many such animals on our planet. Also, these creatures are some of the world's most resistant to radiation. They are practically invulnerable. Now back to our story. It's possible that Jean Hilliard's body went into short cryptobiosis. Perhaps there was some non-freezing liquid in the girl's blood, but no one knows for sure. These days, she has an ordinary job and almost doesn't remember that day. Further research on this topic can help scientists create special medicines that can help in freezing temperatures. Just imagine that you could safely go outside in the winter wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Steam would be coming off your body, and the ice under your feet would be melting. You'd feel hot inside. A dream, perhaps. But realistically, winter coat manufacturers would, of course, never allow it.
Just like Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Captain Kidd was a pirate who sailed around looking for treasure. Only he was less charming and more dangerous. As the legend goes, he was so protective of his loot that he is still out there, guarding it as a ghost. William Kidd, who became famous as Captain Kidd, was born around the 1650s. He told people his birthplace was Dundee, Scotland, but many people think it was a lie. When he was a young man, Kidd settled in New York City. He became friends with powerful people, including 3 governors. Some stories suggest he started his maritime adventures as a rookie on a pirate ship before becoming a well-known sailor. By 1689, Kidd had already become part of a pirate crew. When they were sailing in the Caribbean, Kidd and other men on the ship rebelled. They overpowered the captain and renamed their ship Blessed William, making Kidd the new captain. Kidd gained experience and even assisted certain countries during battles. Once, the governor didn't pay the crew for their services, and Kidd and his team attacked a French island, Marie Galante, and looted it, collecting a huge amount of money. In 1691, Kidd married a woman named Sarah Bradley, who was one of the richest women in New York. She had been married twice before him and was a widow. Her money came as an inheritance from her previous husbands. A few years later, the man in charge of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire asked Captain Kidd to go after some pirates. This wasn't just any request. It had the support of the king and carried a lot of importance. If Kidd had said no, people would have thought he was disloyal and looked down on him. This was the start of the journey that made Captain Kidd famous as a pirate and a character in stories. This trip was funded by a few noble lords who were some of the most powerful people in England at that time. The king himself signed a letter that gave Kidd permission to be a privateer, which is basically a pirate who can do all piratey things with a legal license. This letter said that 10% of the treasure he may find would go to the king. To get some extra cash for the trip, Kidd had to sell one of his ships, the Antigua. And for his special voyage, Kidd got a new ship called the Adventure Galley. It was perfect for chasing pirates, with 34 cannons, oars, and a crew of 150 men. The oars were handy because they let the ship move even when the wind wasn't blowing. Kidd was very picky about his crew. choosing only the best and most loyal officers. But as the adventure galley sailed, something strange happened. Kidd was expected to salute a Navy yacht, but he did not. So, the Navy yacht fired a shot to show Kidd he needed to pay respect. But Kidd and his crew decided to do the opposite. They turned around and slapped their backsides in disrespect. After this, the Navy captain got angry and took many of Kidd's crew members to work for the Navy, even though privateer crews were usually free from this obligation. Kidd, short of men, sailed to New York, where he captured a French ship. To replace his lost crew, he hired a lot of known criminals, some of whom were likely former pirates. In September 1696, Captain Kidd set sail for the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. His journey faced troubles right from the start. Cholera caused many of his crew to get sick and pass away. Even worse, their brand new ship started to have lots of leaks. Kidd was also on a mission to catch some pirates in the Indian Ocean, but he couldn't find them. As his big plan started falling apart, Kidd got desperate to make money to cover his costs. The worst happened a few months later. Kidd attacked one of his own crew members because the man wanted to board a Dutch ship, but it would have been considered an act of piracy. The man passed away due to his injury. Things were going downhill fast for Kidd, and a Royal Navy officer declared him a pirate. Kidd changed his ship's flag to look like it was French and captured a big Indian ship called the Quedagh Merchant. It was loaded with valuable stuff like silk, gold, and silver. Kidd decided to keep the Quedagh Merchant and sailed to Madagascar. There he met another pirate named Robert, who had taken Kidd's ship years ago. There are two different stories about how it went. One says Kidd was nice to him, and the other says Kidd was scared and wanted to wait for his backup to attack. But whatever the case, most of Kidd's crew left him to join Robert. Kidd decided to give up and go back home. He left his old ship, the adventure galley, behind as it was falling apart. Before he set it on fire, he took all valuables from it and boarded the adventure prize. The British authorities had a law that offered pardons to pirates in the Indian Ocean, but they made sure Kidd couldn't get one. They didn't want to forgive him because he was connected to some powerful people in England. Kidd found out he was wanted as soon as he reached Anguilla, and he couldn't use the pardon. The government had changed, and new leaders wanted to use him to make their rivals look bad. They thought Kidd would spill the beans about his powerful supporters. However, Kidd refused to reveal any names, believing that his friends would come to his rescue, but they failed him. Some say he might have escaped punishment if he had talked, but he didn't. Kidd was sent to London to stand trial before the High Court of Admiralty. They accused Kidd of piracy on the high seas and the accident with a crew member. While he waited for his trial, he was locked up in the notorious Newgate prison. They found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to public execution, though many questioned if the evidence was enough for such a harsh verdict. He was executed on May 23, 1701. His body was displayed over the River Thames for 3 years as a warning to anyone thinking about becoming a pirate. Some of Kidd's crewmen were supposed to be punished in the same way, but they were set free before their executions. The loot Captain Kidd had collected over the years made people believe he must have hidden it somewhere. This sparked loads of treasure hunts in different places. Some people say that Kidd might have hidden the treasure on the Rahway River in New Jersey, just across from Staten Island. Evidence suggests that Captain Kidd hid a small stash of treasure on Gardiner's Island, near New York. It was supposedly found and sent to England as proof against Kidd in his trial for piracy. Around the Bay of Fundy, people have been looking for Kidd's treasure since at least 1875. They believed he hid it there during his time as a privateer. There's a place on the island called Money Cove because of these stories. Considering how Kidd met his sad and unfair fate, it's not surprising that people have claimed to see the ghost of Captain Kidd. Some people reported spotting him at Trinity Churchyard as if he was searching for his own grave. There's also a story of two men who tried to look for kids' jewels in 1825. They actually found a treasure box. But before they could crack it open, the ghost of Captain Kidd himself rose up from the ground next to the treasure chest. This sight was so terrifying that it made the men pass out. Both of them claimed to have seen a truly creepy figure emerge from the earth. It breathed out sulfur fumes and seemed to glide over the ground. Thankfully, there is no solid evidence that confirms these ghost stories.
What if I told you there was once a guy who sold coal to Newcastle, bed warmers to the tropics, and stray cats to the Caribbean? It all sounds like some good material for a stand-up comedian sketch, but it was, in fact, the true story of Timothy Dexter. He was born in the winter of 1747 in Malden, Massachusetts. The family's financial situation was far from perfect, so they couldn't afford to give the boy a decent education. At the age of 8, he dropped out of school and started working at a farm. At 16, Timothy became a tanner's apprentice in Boston. This job was considered a lower-class one, but the salary was pretty good. His teacher had unique knowledge of how to work with Moroccan leather, which was a hit among the fashionistas of those times. At 21, Dexter was ready to start his own business, making leather gloves and moose-hide breeches. Things got rowdy in Boston after the new taxes and the famous Tea Party. But Timothy didn't want to leave the city. His loyalty was soon rewarded as he met a wealthy, newly widowed Elizabeth Frothingham. She fell in love with Dexter, and they got married. Mr. Dexter was thrilled to have moved to Boston's posh Charleston neighborhood, but the neighbors didn't share his desire to be friends. Nobles like John Hancock and Thomas Russell, who was then one of the richest people in the country, didn't see Timothy, an uneducated guy who had married into money, as their equal. Our hero couldn't accept that and decided to prove to them that he was worthy of respect. First, he decided to secure a position in public office. He submitted dozens of petitions to his hometown governing body. Finally, they agreed to create a post just for him, Informer of Deer. His task would be to watch over the deer population in town, although the last fawn had left the nearby woods 19 years before. Still, Mr. Dexter loved his new position and moved on to the second part of his master plan, to become rich. He opened a shop in the basement of his wife's house and managed to save several $1,000s. In 1775, the Continental Congress issued around $250 million worth of a new paper currency, the Continental Dollar. Shop owners refused to accept this new money, yet even more of it was printed, and it soon flooded the market and went down in value. They even coined a new expression, "not worth a continental." Dexter's wealthy neighbors wanted to look good in the public eye and support the common folk by buying some of those nearly worthless bills from them. Our hero decided it was a great idea, and so he took all his and his wife's savings and bought tons of those depreciated bills. And his risk totally paid off. Once the United States Constitution came into the picture, holders of Continentals were able to trade them for 1% of the original value. Because Dexter had a lot of that money, it was enough to make him extraordinarily rich. He was sure that would be enough to become friends with the neighbors, but they rejected him again. Mr. Dexter decided the problem was their character and not him, and moved to the coastal mercantile town of Newburyport, Massachusetts, with his family. He now had enough funds to buy a fleet of shipping vessels, a stable full of horses, a fancy chateau with a sea view and lavish furniture, including a coach with his initials. Dexter loved it when people addressed him as Lord. He hired the best artists of European architecture to create over 40 giant wooden statues to adorn his property. Among them, there were figures of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and of course, Timothy Dexter himself. The plaque under his statue described him as the first in the East and in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world. All those statues cost as much as the entire estate, and made people stare. Dexter's wife was so embarrassed he even moved out, and the house turned into a palace of frivolity. His new neighbors didn't enjoy his company and were hoping they could make Dexter go bankrupt with their bad financial advice. One of them suggested that Dexter sell warming pans to the West Indies. Warming pans were a real hit in the 18th century, made out of brass with long handles and were used for keeping the bed warm. But the West Indies? Yeah, that place where it's always warm. Well, it didn't stop our hero, and he purchased 42,000 of those, loaded 9 shipping vessels with them, and set off on a journey with his neighbors chuckling around. Once he arrived in the West Indies and figured no one needed warming pans there, he rebranded the goods and sold them as molasses ladles to owners of sugar plantations. Everyone wanted to buy at least 3 or 4, and he made some really good money with a markup of 79% for each item. He also managed to sell wool mittens in the same place. Asian merchants bought them for export in Siberia. So, selling a heating device to the tropics worked out well. But no one would carry coal to Newcastle, right? One trader managed to convince Dexter that anthracite coal was in huge demand in Britain's largest coal mining town. He had no idea about that little detail and set off to the UK. When he arrived, though, the workers were on strike, and he managed to sell coal to Newcastle with a big markup. Dexter returned to his chateau as a winner with 1.5 barrels of silver. Then he made another eccentric business decision and shipped winter gloves to the South Pacific. He arrived there just in time to run into Portuguese sailors who saved the day and bought the gloves on their way to colder climates as they'd need them there. He also managed to market 340 tons of whale bones he had stocked up on to monopolize the market as ladies' corsets, collar stays, buggy whips, toys, and typewriters, and made some good profit. Once, Newburyport's stray cat situation went out of control. The town meeting voted to get rid of them all, but Dexter offered to buy the cats and take good care of them. And yes, he found a way to sell them at a premium price as well. Warehouse owners in the Caribbean were desperately looking for a solution to their rat problem. It might seem like his choices were just eccentric and emotional, but biographers who analyzed his decisions later believed he actually developed a strategy. Dexter came to realize his key to success was to find out which goods were missing from the market, stock up on them to the brim, and then sell them at the price of his choice. The choice of those goods was often odd, but it all worked out in the end. When he was 50, Dexter wrote a book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, in which he complained about those in power of country and his wife. The book had nearly 9,000 words, but not a single punctuation mark and his own unique spelling and capitalization. One section opened like this. He published the first edition for his own money and distributed the book for free. And yes, it became a hit and was reprinted 8 times. In the second edition, Dexter added an extra page of 11 lines of punctuation marks. It was his response to all those people who complained there weren't any of those in the first edition. He offered them to feel free to insert the signs wherever they wanted. Dexter really cared what other people thought about him all his life. He even staged his own passing away to see who'd show up at the ceremony and how they behave. He revealed that it was all a joke when he noticed his wife wasn't mourning enough. That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and stay on the bright side.